It started in a quiet town just outside of Kansas City, the kind of place where everyone knew your name but didn't pry too much into your business. The Wilson family had always been respected, at least from the outside. There was a lot of history tied to their name, the sort of legacy that lingered in local gossip, but never made its way into anyone's face. Tom Wilson had been the glue that held it all together. He was a proud man in his early 30s, running the family hardware store like his father before him. People trusted him, and when he married Allison 6 years ago, they were considered the town's golden couple. But now, things were starting to fall apart, and Tom couldn't figure out why. It was around the spring of last year when the changes began. At first, they were small, a shift in Allison's mood, an edge in her voice that hadn't been there before. Tom had chalked it up to stress. She'd just started a new job at the local pharmacy, working long hours, and Tom figured the weight of life was taking its toll. But by the summer, it became clear it was something more. Allison had grown distant, physically and emotionally. The easy laughter they used to share disappeared, replaced by awkward silences at dinner and cold shoulders in bed. She often seemed lost in thought, and her phone was never far from her hand. She claimed it was just work, that she was busier than usual, but Tom had his doubts. He began to notice how she would pull away from him at the slightest touch, her body stiffening under his hand. Then there was Jerry, Tom's stepfather. Jerry had married Tom's mother a decade ago after his father died in a car accident. At first, Jerry had been a welcome presence in their lives. He was a charming man, the kind who could strike up a conversation with anyone, and he had done his best to fill the role of stepfather when Tom was younger. But in recent months, Tom began to feel like Jerry was around more than he should be. It was subtle at first. Jerry had always been a frequent visitor, but now it seemed like he was there at odd times, early in the mornings when Tom left for work, or late at night when he came home. Tom often found him in the kitchen with Allison, the two of them talking quietly, their voices dropping to a murmur the moment Tom walked in. "Just catching up," Jerry would say with a grin, but the way his eyes lingered on Allison's face made Tom uncomfortable. Allison always brushed it off, but Tom could see the tension behind her smile. One night, after a particularly long day, Tom came home to find Jerry's car parked in the driveway again. It was a Wednesday in August, just after 9. Tom had been working late at the store, and when he walked in, the house was unusually quiet. He found Allison and Jerry sitting on the back porch, wine glasses in hand. The way they were sitting, too close, too familiar, sent a sharp stab of doubt through his chest. The next morning, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He mentioned it to Allison, hoping she'd reassure him, but instead she snapped. "You're being paranoid," she said, her eyes flashing with something Tom hadn't seen before. "Jerry's like family." Family. The word echoed in Tom's mind long after she said it. Something about the way she said it felt off, forced. That night, as he lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, he began to wonder, was it all in his head? Or was there something else going on between them? By the time fall rolled around, Tom was no longer sure of anything. He started coming home at different times, hoping to catch something, anything, that would explain the unease gnawing at him. Every time he saw Allison and Jerry together, his suspicions grew. He hated himself for it, for even thinking something could be happening between his wife and stepfather. But the more he tried to push it away, the more it consumed him. In the town where they all lived, no one would have suspected a thing. To everyone else, the Wilsons were just another family, living their lives like everyone else. But Tom knew better. Something was happening in his house, something dark, and it was only a matter of time before he found out the truth. He just didn't know how far it would go. By the time October rolled in, the tension in Tom's house was almost unbearable. He and Allison barely spoke, and when they did, it was cold, distant, like they were strangers forced to live under the same roof. Tom had tried to ignore it, tried to push down the gnawing doubts that kept him awake at night, but the cracks in their marriage were becoming impossible to ignore. Allison's behavior had grown more secretive. She was always on her phone, texting someone late into the night, the screen lighting up her face in the darkness. When Tom asked her who she was talking to, she'd wave him off. "Work," she'd say, her voice tight. "You know how crazy it's been." But Tom didn't buy it. He'd seen her quickly swipe the screen and turn the phone face down when he walked into the room. He'd started noticing other things, too, small details that felt like pieces of a larger puzzle he couldn't yet see. The way she'd dress up on random weekday afternoons, even when she claimed she was just running errands. The way her eyes flickered with guilt whenever Jerry came over. Tom's paranoia began to grow, taking root in his mind like a weed. He found himself watching them closely whenever they were in the same room, analyzing every glance, every small interaction. Jerry had become a constant presence in their lives, always finding some excuse to stop by. He'd show up with groceries for Allison, or to help fix something around the house, but it always seemed to be when Tom wasn't there. Tom couldn't shake the feeling that they were sharing something behind his back, something more than just conversation. Then came the night that finally shattered whatever illusion he'd been clinging to. It was late, around 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday in mid-October. Tom had come home early from the store, feeling sick with the flu and hoping to sleep it off. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Jerry's car parked out front again. His stomach dropped. He hadn't told Allison he was coming home early. She had no reason to expect him. He walked into the house quietly, almost like he was afraid of what he might find. The house was dark, but a soft glow came from the living room, where he could hear low voices. Tom froze just outside the doorway. "It's getting too risky," he heard Allison say, her voice low and urgent. Jerry's deep voice followed, calm and soothing. "I told you we'll be careful. Tom's not going to find out." Tom's heart pounded in his chest. He felt lightheaded, like the room was spinning around him. He knew he should walk in, confront them, demand an explanation, but his feet wouldn't move. Instead, he pressed himself against the wall, his hands shaking as he listened. "I don't know," Allison said. "He's been suspicious lately. I don't want to ruin everything." "Trust me," Jerry said, his voice dripping with confidence. "I'll handle Tom. He doesn't suspect a thing." Tom's hands clenched into fists. They were talking about him, about his suspicions, just like he had feared. But what chilled him to the bone wasn't just the conversation itself. It was the tone. The way Allison spoke to Jerry was different, softer, almost intimate. And the way Jerry reassured her made Tom's stomach twist with something dark, something close to rage. He stepped back, his mind racing. He didn't need to hear more. He'd heard enough. There was no mistaking what was happening now. His wife and his stepfather weren't just close. They were hiding something, something that had been going on for God knows how long. Tom left the house quietly, his mind numb, and sat in his truck for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the dashboard. His birthday was only a few days away, October 15th. Last year they had thrown a small family dinner for him, Jerry included, of course. It seemed like a lifetime ago. Now, nothing felt real. His mind raced with questions, anger and confusion swirling inside him. How long had this been happening? Was it an affair? Or something worse? The next morning, Tom couldn't bring himself to confront them, not yet. Instead, he found himself drawn to Allison's phone, which she had left on the kitchen counter as she showered. His hands shook as he unlocked it, heart pounding with a mix of guilt and desperation. He scrolled through her messages and found exactly what he'd been dreading. Text after text between her and Jerry, late-night exchanges filled with flirtatious words, and careful plans to meet when Tom was at work. Some messages were explicit, leaving no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The final message made his blood run cold. It was from Jerry, sent just a few hours before. "Let's talk later, same time. I'll make sure Tom doesn't find out. We're too deep now." Tom put the phone down slowly, his hands shaking. He could feel his pulse in his temples, a sickening rage building inside him. His whole world had shifted, and there was no going back. They had crossed a line, one he could never forgive. It was the evening of their wedding anniversary, November 7th, a date Tom used to look forward to. This year, he had planned nothing. What was there to celebrate? The house felt suffocating. Allison had barely spoken to him all day, a tense silence lingering between them like a fog. Tom spent most of the evening in the living room, nursing a drink and pretending to watch TV while Allison wandered around the house, avoiding him. He couldn't stop thinking about the messages he'd found on her phone weeks earlier, the texts between her and Jerry. He hadn't confronted her yet. He didn't know how to. The thought of putting it all out there, of hearing her confirm his worst fears, was too much to bear. He kept waiting for the right moment, but that moment never came. At around 9 p.m., Allison told him she was going out to run an errand, her voice casual, like she was just heading to the store. But Tom knew better. He had been watching her movements for weeks, tracking the times she'd leave late at night for no clear reason. He didn't say anything, just nodded and watched her walk out the door. Once he heard her car pull away, something inside him snapped. He couldn't do it anymore. He needed answers. Grabbing his jacket, Tom followed her. He knew where she was going, Jerry's house. His stepfather lived just 15 minutes away, alone since Tom's mother had passed 2 years earlier. As he drove through the dark streets, Tom's mind raced. His heart pounded in his chest, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. This was it. He was going to catch them, and there would be no more lies, no more pretending. Tom parked a few houses down from Jerry's place, not wanting to alert them to his presence. The house was dark, except for a faint glow from the living room. He crept quietly across the yard, peering through the window, and that's when he saw them. Allison and Jerry were sitting close on the couch, their faces inches apart. Jerry's hand was resting on her knee, and Allison was leaning into him, her face flushed. They were talking softly, but Tom couldn't hear the words. It didn't matter. The intimacy between them was undeniable, and suddenly everything clicked into place. Every late-night errand, every suspicious glance, every moment that had felt wrong over the past year, it all came crashing down on him. Without thinking, Tom stormed to the front door and threw it open, the force rattling the frame. Allison and Jerry jumped apart, their faces going pale when they saw him. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jerry demanded, but his voice lacked the usual confidence. Allison stood, her hands trembling. "Tom, I can explain." Tom's voice came out as a low, dangerous growl. "Explain what? That you've been sleeping with him. My own stepfather." He stepped toward them, fists clenched at his sides, trying to control the fury surging through him. His eyes locked on Allison. "How long?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Tom shook his head in disgust, turning his gaze to Jerry. "You," he spat. "You're supposed to be family. How could you do this to me?" Jerry stood up, his face hardening. "You don't understand, Tom. It's not what you think." "Not what I think." Tom laughed bitterly. "I saw the texts. I heard you talking. You've been sneaking around behind my back for months, maybe longer." He turned back to Allison, his voice shaking with anger and pain. "Was it all a lie? Did you ever love me, or was this just some sick game?" Allison's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't like that, Tom. I never meant for it to happen." "Then what was it?" Tom shouted, the words bursting out of him. "How long have you been betraying me? Tell me the truth." Allison sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "It started last year. After your mom died, things got complicated. Jerry was there for me when you weren't. I was lonely, and it just happened." Tom felt a cold wave of nausea roll through him. "Don't you dare blame me for this," he said through clenched teeth. "You made a choice. Both of you did." Jerry stepped forward, his voice steady but cold. "You need to calm down, Tom. This isn't just about you." Tom's vision blurred with rage. "Calm down? You're telling me to calm down when you've been screwing my wife behind my back?" He lunged at Jerry, shoving him hard against the wall. Jerry grunted, trying to push him off, but Tom was too strong. All the pent-up anger, the betrayal, the months of suspicion boiled over, and before he knew it, he had Jerry by the collar, his fist raised. "Stop it, Tom!" Allison screamed, grabbing his arm. "Please, just stop!" Tom froze, his chest heaving, his fist trembling in the air. For a moment, no one moved. Then he slowly released Jerry, letting him slump against the wall. Tom stepped back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the weight of everything crashing down on him. Allison stood there, shaking, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never wanted to hurt you. Tom stared at her, his heart breaking all over again. You already have. He turned and walked out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The night air was cold against his skin, but it did nothing to numb the pain tearing him apart. He didn't know where to go or what to do. All he knew was that the life he thought he had was gone, shattered by the people he trusted most. As he sat in his truck, staring blankly at the dark road ahead, Tom realized there was no coming back from this. His marriage was over, his family broken beyond repair, and somewhere deep inside, a darker thought began to take root, a thought he couldn't quite shake. This wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. It was exactly 1 week after their anniversary, the day that should have been a celebration of 6 years of marriage. Instead, Tom was sitting alone in his darkened living room, nursing a bottle of whiskey. The house was silent, cold. Allison had left earlier that evening, claiming she needed some space to think. Tom didn't believe her. He knew exactly where she had gone. Back to Jerry. The bottle had dulled the edges of his pain, but the anger still burned inside him, hotter than ever. He couldn't stop thinking about that night in Jerry's house, about the lies, the betrayal. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them together, whispering, touching. The rage twisted in his gut, relentless, suffocating. He couldn't live like this anymore. By the time midnight rolled around, Tom's decision had been made. His mind was fogged with alcohol and fury, but one thought cut through it all, sharp and clear. This had to end tonight. He couldn't watch them destroy him any longer. He grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, driving toward Jerry's place with one hand on the wheel and the other gripping a small hunting knife he kept in the glove box. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound echoing in his ears. He didn't have a plan, not really. All he knew was that he needed to confront them, to make them face what they had done. When he pulled up to Jerry's house, he saw it. Their cars parked side by side in the driveway, like a cruel reminder of how intertwined their lives had become. Tom's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the house, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he stepped out of the truck and marched toward the front door. This time, he didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open with a loud crash, the force sending it slamming against the wall. Inside, Jerry and Allison shot up from the couch, their faces pale with shock. "What the hell is this, Tom?" Jerry barked, standing up, his face twisting into a sneer. "You've lost your damn mind!" Tom didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on Allison, her wide eyes filled with terror. "How could you?" Tom's voice was hoarse, raw with emotion. "You're my wife, Allison, my wife!" "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, it wasn't supposed to be like this." But her words felt empty, hollow. Tom took a step toward her, his heart hammering in his chest. "Sorry? Sorry doesn't fix this. You lied to me. You cheated on me with him." He pointed the knife at Jerry, the blade gleaming under the dim light. Jerry stepped forward, hands raised in mock surrender. "Tom, calm down. Let's talk about this. You're being irrational." "Irrational?" Tom's voice broke, his throat tightening. "I trusted you, both of you, and you've been laughing behind my back this whole time." His vision blurred with tears of rage, his body trembling. He took another step closer, waving the knife in front of him, the air between them charged with tension. Jerry's face twisted into a smirk. "You're weak, Tom. Always have been. You couldn't even keep your wife happy, so don't blame us for what happened." That was it. Tom snapped. With a roar of fury, he lunged at Jerry, the knife flashing through the air. He felt the blade connect with flesh, heard Jerry's sharp intake of breath as it sank into his side. Blood poured out, dark and warm, staining Tom's hand. Jerry staggered back, his eyes wide with shock, clutching his side. You stabbed me!" he gasped, blood bubbling from his mouth. He collapsed to the floor, choking on his own breath. Allison screamed, rushing to Jerry's side, tears streaming down her face. "What have you done?" she sobbed, pressing her hands to Jerry's wound. But it was no use. The blood wouldn't stop. Tom stood frozen, staring down at Jerry's crumpled body. the reality of what he had just done slowly sinking in. His hand was still clutching the knife, slick with blood, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. He hadn't meant for this to happen. Or had he? He wasn't sure anymore. All he knew was that it was over. Jerry's labored breaths grew fainter, his eyes glazing over as his life slipped away. Allison was shaking uncontrollably, her hands soaked in blood, her sobs filling the room. Tom took a step back, his heart pounding in his ears. He looked at Allison, her face twisted in grief and horror, and in that moment, he felt nothing but emptiness. The rage that had fueled him was gone, replaced by a hollow void. He had wanted revenge, but now, staring at the wreckage in front of him, he realized that nothing could undo what had been done. Jerry was dead. The man who had destroyed his marriage, his life, was gone. But the cost was too great. Tom had crossed a line he could never come back from. Allison's voice cut through the silence, barely a whisper. "Tom, what do we do now?" Tom looked down at the blood on his hands, at Jerry's lifeless body on the floor. He didn't have an answer. The only thing he knew for sure was that nothing would ever be the same again. The police arrived at Jerry's house at 1:47 a.m. Allison had called them, her voice frantic and choked with sobs. By the time they got there, Jerry was already gone, his body lying cold and lifeless on the living room floor, a pool of blood beneath him. Tom didn't resist. He stood by the door when they came in, his hands still stained red, the knife discarded at his feet. He didn't say a word as they cuffed him and led him to the squad car. The media picked up the story the next day. "Local business owner arrested in brutal family murder," the headlines read. The reporters latched onto the details. A man stabbing his stepfather in a jealous rage, a love affair unraveling into violence. Neighbors were shocked, speaking to cameras with wide-eyed disbelief. "They were such a normal family," one woman said. "I would never have imagined this." Tom sat in a holding cell at the county jail, his mind numb. The reality of what he'd done still hadn't fully settled in. All he could think about was how things had spiraled so quickly, how his marriage had crumbled, how Jerry's betrayal had consumed him, and how one reckless act of violence had changed everything. He had wanted answers, but in the end, all he was left with was a hollow emptiness. Allison, too, was broken. In the days following Jerry's death, she withdrew into herself, avoiding the press, avoiding everyone. Her affair had been laid bare for the entire town to see, and there was no escaping the shame. She couldn't even grieve Jerry properly, couldn't visit his grave, couldn't say goodbye. She was trapped in her own guilt, knowing that her choices had led to this. She had destroyed her marriage, ruined Tom's life, and now Jerry was dead. Tom's trial was set for January, but the details had already leaked by mid-November. The prosecution painted him as a jealous, vengeful husband who snapped. His lawyer argued temporary insanity, citing the months of emotional turmoil that had driven him to the breaking point. But none of it changed the fact that Tom had killed a man, and there was no undoing that. The unraveling of the Wilson family secrets became a public spectacle, every detail dissected and discussed. People whispered about the affair, about the dysfunction that had been festering beneath the surface for years. But in the end, the story faded from the headlines, like all tragedies do, and the town moved on. For Tom, there was no moving on. In his cell, the days blurred together, marked only by the occasional visit from his lawyer or a passing guard. He replayed that night over and over in his mind, wondering where it all went wrong. Could he have done something differently? Could he have stopped it before it spiraled out of control? He didn't have the answers, and now it was too late. The darkness that had crept into his life, the betrayal, the lies, they had all led to this. And now, all that was left was the wreckage. Tom was alone, facing a future defined by his actions, while Allison was left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by secrets. In the end, Tom had wanted justice, but what he found was something far darker. Now, as he sat in the quiet, sterile confines of his cell, he realized that there were no winners in this story, only the broken, left to live with the consequences of their choices. And that's the tragic story of Tom Wilson. A man driven to the edge by betrayal and secrets within his own family. What do you think? Was Tom's violent reaction inevitable? Or could things have turned out differently if the truth had come out sooner? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into real-life cases like this one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.